Feeling congested, Grace Fryer excused herself from the front office of the bank, withdrawing to privacy to blow her nose. When she is safely out of range of sight and sound, she blew hard into the handkerchief she had removed from her pocket. As Grace proceeded to remove the handkerchief from her nose to fold it in half and try again, she stopped dead in her tracks. Alarmed by the sight, Grace nearly fell over. The handkerchief glowed. Grace couldn't help but to think back to her time working as a dial painter at a radium factory in Orange, New Jersey. Sure, the radium glowed there, that was the point. They were all told countless times that it was perfectly safe, and once again when a question arose about the method of making sure the tip of the paintbrush was extra pointy, by placing it between their lips and wetting it with their tongue. But why here? How had she made this handkerchief glow before? Was she infected in some way? This would only be the beginning of oddities surrounding Grace Fryer's life. A heartbreaking reality would soon set in that affected more than just Grace, but those who shared the familiar title of Dial Painter. And before long, they would share a new title, the Radium Girls. Marie and Pierre Curie first laid eyes on one another in 1894 at Sorbonne University in Paris, France. Pierre resided at the School of Physics and Chemistry as a professor, and Marie as a student studying physics and mathematics. The couple quickly bonded over their common interest in natural sciences, and by July 1895, they would be married. In the same year, Pierre would publish his doctoral thesis on the connection between temperature and magnetism, giving birth to what we know today as Curie's Law. By 1897, the couple would share the birth of their daughter Irene, and soon after, Pierre would help secure Marie a job in the school's laboratory. Here, she would conduct further research into her husband's discoveries in magnetism, specifically into the properties of magnetism in steel. But bound for much more, Marie would spark interest in writing her own doctoral thesis, and soon a research topic would present itself. Wilhelm Röntgen amazed the world on December 28, 1895, with his discovery of X-rays, and French physicist Antoine-Henri Becquerel was just as impressed. Inspired by Röntgen's revelation before him, Becquerel was inclined to find his own discovery in X-ray science by reaching for a connection between invisible radiation and phosphorescence. On February 24, 1896, Becquerel would stand before an assembly presenting his newfound discoveries armed with evidence. He would explain by example that when uranium-based crystals were exposed to sunlight, they would leave an everlasting shadow on photographic plates, even when wrapped in thick black paper. This experiment would be an important footnote in his later accidental discovery of spontaneous radiation, and Marie Curie's inspiration for research. Like her husband before her, Marie sought recognition through the publication of her doctoral thesis. Where the L'Académie des Sciences fell short in their attention in Becquerel's discovery, Marie didn't, and was set on a path of research into the strange uranium rays. Working with the tools amongst her ranks, Marie used an electrometer at her disposal. This electrometer, fabricated by her husband and brother-in-law, worked on the basis of piezoelectric effect, providing insight into materials that gave off weak electrical currents. In her endeavor to find a chemical compound comparable to uranium, she'd make multiple insightful discoveries. Firstly, she provided a prominent quality about radiation. The strength of radiation did not depend solely on the compound at hand, but on the amount of uranium or thorium it contained. She proposed that many chemical compounds of the same element are different in structure and chemical characteristics. Lastly, after she was triumphant in her research of all elements of the periodic table, she concluded that the ability to radiate is linked to the interior of the atom, and that only uranium or thorium contained the ability to give off radiation. This discovery would be groundbreaking and considered her biggest addition to the development of physics. Amazed by his wife's innovative finding, Pierre would soon join her side, and by the end of June 1898, they would discover a substance 300 times stronger than uranium. The couple accounted for their accomplishments to the public in a publication in July of the same year, suggesting the name polonium for their newfound substance. Then on December 26, 1898, the Curies presented to l'Académie des Sciences evidence of an additional element, and with it, a new name, radium. In 1903, Antoine Henry Becquerel, Pierre Curie, and Marie Curie would graciously share a Nobel Peace Prize in Physics for their discoveries in radiation. While the world of science shared their names, the rest of the world embodied the thought of this miracle compound, seeking to use its properties to its fullest potential. Dr. Sabin Arnold von Shashaki had just completed his doctorate in medicine at the University of Moscow, and his eyes were set on the promising narrative of the American dream. In 1906, he moved to the United States, specifically immigrating to New York City, where he'd spend the next 10 years practicing medicine. Dr. von Shashaki stayed busy during his tenure in New York before moving to New Jersey, providing ideas and contributions to the use of radium. In 1913, alongside Dr. Edward J. Lehman, he'd play an important part in the development of radioluminescent paint, seeing long-term use within one's home. In 1921, he provided the following quote, "The time will doubtlessly come when you'll have a room in your own house lighted by radium. The light thrown off by radium paint on walls and ceilings would in color and tone be soft like moonlight." By 1917, Dr. von Shashaki, along with colleague Dr. George S. Willis and a handful of investors, would form the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, later renamed the United States Radium Corp. The group's primary focus was producing uranium until eventually shifting to the application of Dr. von Shashaki's radioluminescent paint that he dubbed Undark. The United States Radium Corp wasted little time in opening 3 factories across New Jersey, one in New York, Jersey City, and Orange, and with this ample workforce, they jumped at the opportunity to assist the U.S. military during World War I with a handful of products doused in Undark. While the management team and scientists took the utmost precautions when handling the radium products, they could care less about their workers. This carelessness was evident by a common practice influenced by management throughout the production lines. They instructed the young women who worked in the factories to place the tip of their paintbrushes between their lips and to wet it with their tongue to keep the tip extra straight. The reasoning was that dial and watch painting was delicate work, and keeping the paintbrush tip straight was crucial in providing the best quality product. Among the workforce at the Radium Factory in Orange, New Jersey, was Grace Fryer. Daily activities for Grace and her fellow co-workers included manning a workstation with a rack of dials nearby, ready to be painted with radioluminescent solution, composed of glue, water, and radium powder that would be mixed together into a glowing greenish-white paint. Once the paint was ready to be applied, each of the dial painters would dip their brushes in and then neatly apply the paint to the dial's number. When the brush lost its pointed appearance, the women lost the ability to paint accurately. To combat this, each painter would follow the standard practice of bringing the brush back to the pointed form by dragging the bristles between their lips. Grace is quoted saying, "Our instructors told us to point them with our lips, and I think I pointed mine 6 times to every watch dial. It didn't have any taste, and I didn't know it was harmful." Much like Grace, each of the other women shared a similar routine, unbeknownst at the time of the harmful and life-threatening effects of radium. In fact, much of the outside world saw radium as some sort of magical cure-all because of its known use in cancer treatment. The dial painter's exposure to radium expanded much outside of the common practice, and many women would often paint their nails, teeth, and faces because of the glow-in-the-dark properties. Years later, when Grace left her dial painting job for a more suitable employment at a local bank, the lasting effects remained. First, she noticed the glowing snot had filled her handkerchief after she blew her nose, and before long, Her teeth began to ache. By 1922, her teeth began to fall out, and she suffered acute jaw pain. Throughout her painful struggles, Grace would visit various medical professionals who were alarmed by the X-ray findings. Grace was enduring severe bone decay, and not only in her mouth, but in her back as well. This finding left doctors bewildered. They hadn't seen anything like it before. Finally, in 1925, a doctor suggested to Grace that her condition would have been the everlasting effects of working with radium at her previous employer. Grace would not be the only worker to suffer from long-lasting effects due to radium poisoning, and because the human body confuses radium with calcium, many of the cases were horrendous. Like Grace, many victims saw the loss of teeth. Beyond this, many experienced brittle bones that were easily broken, and, in some cases, total spinal collapse. By the late 1920s, it is estimated that more than 50 people had died due to radium exposure, with one of the most devastating cases recorded being that of Molly Maggio. Molly Maggio was a fellow dial painter and co-worker to Grace, and with the onset of a mystery illness, she had no choice but to quit her job in 1922. Molly first noticed excruciating pain in her jaw, in the form of a toothache. She soon retreated to the dentist for a tooth removal. This pain only continued to spread, and multiple teeth had to be removed. Where her teeth once sat, now blood and pus-filled ulcers began to grow, making simple everyday tasks, like breathing, hard to accomplish. This illness continued to spread from Molly's mouth to the rest of her body, and eventually, pain in her limbs would grow so terribly that it rendered her unable to walk. It wasn't long before Molly's mouth and lower jaw became a large abscess. Molly would visit the dentist for one of her last times in May of 1922, suffering from unbearable jaw pain, and to the dentist's horror, her jaw gave way to the weight of his fingers gently nudging. It was discovered that radium poisoning had deteriorated much of Molly's bone structure, leaving it very porous. Later, on September 12th of the same year, 24-year-old Molly Maggio would succumb to the lasting effects of radium when her throat deteriorated, causing her jugular vein to collapse, and unfortunately leaving her to choke to death on her own blood before medical assistance could intervene. Henceforth, Molly Maggio would set a precedent for what was to come for many of her fellow co-workers. Following the opinion of her doctor, and fearful of the same fate as her peers, Grace sought to expose the atrocities of the U.S. Radium Corps, and it didn't take long for the organization to rear its wicked head in the form of a misinformation campaign. As Grace worked to expose the company, she was met by a Columbia University specialist, claiming to be referred by friends, wanting to help Grace in her fight. Frederick Flynn offered to examine Grace's conditions, and she obliged. Flynn would be fruitful with evidence supporting his claims that Grace was in perfect health. It wouldn't be long after this encounter that Flynn was exposed as a fraud. He wasn't a licensed professional, and he lacked any medical training. Frederick Flynn was an industrial toxicologist and the vice president of U.S. Radium, who hoped to deter Grace Fryer in her pursuit of justice by squashing her confidence like a bug. Grace would not be hindered, and was valiant in her efforts to take down U.S. Radium. As she gained momentum, 4 of her fellow dial painters would join her side, determined to file a lawsuit against the company, remaining resilient in their efforts to find a lawyer to take their case seriously. Eventually, in 1927, the women were successful in finding aid in their fight in the form of a young lawyer by the name of Raymond Berry. With the help of Berry, the women raised a lawsuit against U.S. Radium for their inhumanity in the form of $250,000, but because many of the women were living on borrowed time, with some given less than a year to live, they eventually settled for significantly less, $10,000 each, and a year of annuity of $600 for as long as they lived. Beyond this cash settlement, they were truly victorious in their endeavors by exposing the deadly effects of radium poisoning because of their efforts. The case of the Radium Girls was the first of its kind, in a pivotal moment in the history of employee rights. The atrocities exposed during the movement shined a light on the horrible conditions that some employees faced and where their employers' hearts and minds truly lay. As a result, the case would give birth to multiple laws intended to protect employees by holding employers accountable for their health and safety, eventually leading to the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. If this was a movie, we'd expect a happy ending on the part of Grace Fryer, but unfortunately, it isn't so. Grace Fryer passed away on October 27, 1933, at the young age of 34, suffering from the lasting effects of radium poisoning, like many of her fellow dial painters. I think it's important that we remember Grace Fryer and her fellow Radium Girls for their tenacity. Let's remember to always stand up for what is right, and in life's hardest battles, fight like you're dying. Hey guys, that's all for this one. If you've made it this far and you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget, take advantage of that comment sections. I'd like to really hear what you thought of the video, what you thought about the story of the Radium Girls, and just open up the conversation for future videos. If you're looking for more great stories on government conspiracies and all of history's darkest secrets, be sure to check out my Medium blog site. The link will be in the description of this video and available on my YouTube main page. If you're looking for more of a fictional nightmare to keep you up at night, be sure to check out both of my books, From a Dark Place and The Promise. These links as well are available in the same place. Once again, I truly do appreciate all your continued support, watching my videos, listening to my stories. And if you ever have a story to share or a video suggestion, please let me know. Once again, that's all for this one. Thank you guys. See you next week on Creepy Unsolved.